The Secret Beneath the Staircase, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment where you are from. After all, as Poirot himself would say, it is not where one comes from that matters. It is what one sees when one arrives. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The House That Leans. There is something wrong in this house, Monsieur Poirot, the letter had read. I cannot tell you what it is. Perhaps I am being foolish, but I believe then else that you would see it, where others do not. Hercule Poirot had read the letter 3 times. He had a profound respect for letters that did not accuse, did not demand, and did not explain too much. Mrs. Laura Hargreaves had written with the careful restraint of a woman who was frightened of being thought hysterical. That, in itself, told him a great deal. He arrived at Greythorne House on a Thursday afternoon in late September, when the Surrey countryside wore the subdued colours of an old tapestry, and the air smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. The motor car that had collected him from the village station moved along a narrow lane bordered by ancient hedgerows, and Poirot, who did not care greatly for the English countryside at the best of times, found himself observing the approach to the house with an attention that was entirely professional. The house appeared at a bend in the lane, standing 3 stories tall against a grey sky. It was not beautiful precisely. It was something older than beautiful. The stone was darkened by decades of weather, the roofline irregular in a manner that suggested additions and modifications undertaken across several generations, each one slightly at odds with the last. The garden was well kept, but not fashionable. It was a garden tended out of duty rather than passion. Poirot tilted his egg-shaped head to one side. The house, he decided, had the appearance of a place that had been waiting for something for a very long time. He was received at the door by a woman whom he recognized at once as belonging to that particular species, the indispensable one. She was perhaps 50, with a composed face that had once been handsome and was now merely authoritative. Her dark hair was streaked with grey, pulled back with severe neatness. Her dress was plain and well pressed. She held herself with the quietude of a person who has learned to occupy as little space as possible. Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was pleasant, unhurried. I am Eleanor Hargreaves. Laura told us to expect you. I hope the journey was not too disagreeable. It was entirely agreeable, mademoiselle, I thank you. Poirot stepped into the hall and removed his hat with a small, precise movement. You have a most characterful house. A faint expression crossed Eleanor's face. Amusement, perhaps, or something that had once been amusement and had gradually settled into something more resigned. Yes, she said, it is that. The hall was large and dim, its oak panelling the colour of old tea. Poirot's sharp eyes travelled the space with the unhurried thoroughness of a man cataloguing an auction lot. Hunting prints, a barometer, a coat rack bearing 3 hats and a shooting stick, a turkey carpet whose colours had faded to the amber and rose of autumn. And there, upon a side table among a small arrangement of framed photographs, a single frame lying face down. Poirot said nothing. He filed the observation away with the care of a man who knows that what is absent often speaks more plainly than what is present. He was shown to his room, comfortable, orderly, smelling faintly of lavender, and left to refresh himself before dinner. Through the window he could observe the garden below, where a man stood smoking beneath a copper beech tree with the concentrated stillness of a person who is thinking thoughts he would prefer not to think. Eleanor had mentioned the family at some length during their brief exchange in the hall. Sir Malcolm Hargreaves, the patriarch, presently resting before dinner, a habit his heart condition had lately made necessary. Adrian Hargreaves, the elder son, who managed what remained of the family's business concerns and would be joining them shortly. Laura, of course, whom Poirot knew from her letter as a woman of perception. She had not mentioned the man under the copper beech tree. Dinner was at 7:30. It was served with the mechanical punctuality of a household in which meals had become the scaffolding upon which an entire way of life was constructed. The dining room was sombre and handsome, dominated by a table capable of seating 12, at the head of which sat Sir Malcolm Hargreaves. He was a large man even now at 72, though age had subtracted something from his mass that left him looking, Poirot thought, like a monument from which a portion had been carefully removed. His face was heavy-featured, accustomed to authority. When he spoke, which was frequently, the table listened. When he was silent, the table waited. Monsieur Poirot. Sir Malcolm subjected him to an evaluating look of the kind that successful men develop early and never lose. Laura tells me you're the fellow who looks at things and deduces them, like a magician, she says. Laura flatters me enormously. Poirot inclined his head. I am simply a man who finds it interesting to observe what is in front of him. Most people, you understand, look but they do not see. Sir Malcolm grunted, apparently satisfied with this modest disclaimer. Beside him, Eleanor was already seeing to the serving of the soup with the quiet efficiency of a woman performing a task she has performed 10,000 times. Across the table, Laura Hargreaves met Poirot's eyes for a brief moment. She was a handsome woman in her middle 40s, with the watchful composure of someone who has learned to read a room the way a sailor reads weather. She gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement, a quiet gratitude, and returned her attention to her soup. At her left, her husband, Adrian Hargreaves, was engaged in the delicate operation of not disagreeing with his father about something. It was visible in the set of his shoulders, in the careful blandness of his expression. He was a man, Poirot judged, who had spent a considerable portion of his adult life becoming invisible. The young woman introduced as Clara, Adrian and Laura's daughter, 16 and solemn, sat at the far end of the table and did not speak. She had the quality of certain quiet children, of appearing to observe far more than anyone imagined. Poirot approved of this quality in a general sense, though he made a mental note not to underestimate her. And then there was the man who had been standing under the copper beech tree. He arrived 4 minutes late, which Poirot suspected was not an accident. He was perhaps 50, lean in the manner of a man who has spent years outdoors and not always comfortably. There was about him the particular look of someone who had once belonged to this room and had chosen, at considerable cost, to cease belonging to it. Daniel. Sir Malcolm's voice was precise and uninflected. Father. The word was returned with the same precision, carrying neither warmth nor hostility, or rather carrying both, in such exact cancellation that the result was a kind of charged silence. Daniel Hargreaves took the remaining chair, accepted the bread roll that Eleanor had already placed before him without his asking for it, and turned politely to Poirot. "You must be the detective." "I am a visitor," Poirot replied pleasantly. "I am here to enjoy the country air and the excellent hospitality of your family. Nothing more." Daniel smiled briefly, without humour. "Of course you are." The dinner proceeded. The soup gave way to a roast, admirably cooked. Sir Malcolm held forth on the subject of a planning dispute in the village. Adrian agreed with him. Eleanor saw to it that no glass went empty and no dish was passed in the wrong direction. Laura listened. Clara watched. Daniel ate in the silence of a man keeping something carefully leashed. It was toward the end of the meal that Sir Malcolm made an announcement. "Now that we are all here," he said in the tone of a man accustomed to beginning sentences with this phrase, "there are certain matters to be discussed. The house will require renovation in the East Wing. There are decisions to be made about responsibilities. Eleanor," he looked at his daughter, "we shall talk tomorrow." Eleanor said, "Of course, father," and passed the salt to Adrian without being asked. Poirot observed the slight whitening of her knuckles around the salt cellar before she released it. Later, when the household had retired and the corridors of Greythorne had settled into the deep quiet of an old house at night, Poirot stood at the window of his room. He lit nothing. He required no distraction. He simply stood and thought. A woman had written to him to say that something was wrong, and she could not say what. He had seen in the space of a single evening the photograph lying face down in the hall. He had seen Eleanor Hargreaves serve a family that did not see her. He had seen Daniel Hargreaves watch the staircase with an expression that was not the expression of a man admiring architecture. He had seen a family balanced on a point as fine as a needle. "Oui," murmured Hercule Poirot to the darkened garden below. "Something is wrong in this house." He was quite certain by now that it was only a matter of time before they all discovered precisely what. Chapter 2. The Weight of Routine. The household rose at 7. Poirot knew this not because anyone had told him, but because at 7 minutes past the hour he heard the particular sequence of sounds that announced it. The measured tread of Eleanor Hargreaves descending the stairs, the distant percussion of a kettle being filled, the low mutter of the boiler asserting itself in the walls. These were not the sounds of a house waking. They were the sounds of a house resuming. He lay still for a moment, listening with the attentiveness he brought to all things, and thought about the difference. He breakfasted at 8, as instructed, and found himself the first of the family to appear. The dining room had been laid with a precision that he found professionally admirable, each place setting at exactly the same distance from the table's edge, the marmalade and the butter, and the toast rack arranged with the geometry of long habit. Eleanor was not in the room, but her work was everywhere in it. Sir Malcolm arrived at 8 minutes past the hour, which Poirot suspected was itself a kind of punctuality. The punctuality of a man who considers it his prerogative to be slightly awaited. He unfolded his newspaper, accepted his coffee without acknowledgement, and read in silence. Laura appeared shortly afterward, offered Poirot a composed good morning, and took her seat with the economy of motion of a woman who has learned not to disturb the atmosphere before it has fully settled. Adrian came last, slightly flushed, apologizing for no reason that was apparent to anyone. Daniel did not appear at breakfast at all. "My brother," Adrian said to Poirot, with the careful casualness of a man who has rehearsed the information, keeps irregular hours. He was always that way, even as a boy. "Indeed," said Poirot. He buttered his toast with great deliberateness. "And the Mademoiselle Clara, she does not join you?" "Clara breakfasts in her room when she is studying," Laura said. There was something in her tone. Not defensive, but careful, in the way a person is careful around a subject that has edges. Sir Malcolm turned a page of his newspaper. The morning proceeded with the unhurried momentum of a place in which each hour had its assigned occupation. Poirot was given, as he had requested, the freedom of the house. He accepted this freedom thoughtfully, which is to say, he did not rush, and he did not explore. He simply moved through the rooms as a guest might, pausing here to examine a watercolour, there to stand before the bookshelves in the morning room with his head tilted and his small hands clasped behind his back. The books told him things. They always did. A household's library is its autobiography, written without intending to be. Here were the practical volumes, agriculture, architecture, military history, that belonged to Sir Malcolm's generation and outlook. Here were 3 shelves of novels, the spines softened with repeated reading, that could only be Eleanor's. And here, tucked between a volume on Surrey churches and a gazetteer published in 1931, was a child's exercise book with the name Daniel Hargreaves, written on the cover in the round, effortful script of a boy of perhaps 9 or 10. Poirot did not remove it. He noted it and moved on. It was in the hall on his way back toward the staircase that he encountered Mrs. Whitcomb. The housekeeper was a woman of 60 or thereabouts, constructed along architectural lines, square and solid, and giving the impression of having been built to last several centuries. She was polishing the hall table with the focused intensity of a person who finds in physical labour a reliable substitute for thought. She did not look up when Poirot appeared, though he was quite certain she had heard him. "A fine piece of furniture," Poirot remarked, indicating the table. "It is," Mrs. Whitcomb agreed without inflection. "The family have been here a long time, I understand. 35 years I've been in this house." She paused her polishing for precisely 1 moment. "Before that, it was the Margraves. Before that, I couldn't say." Poirot let a small silence develop in the manner of a man entirely comfortable with silence. It was a technique he had found more productive than most questions. People, he had observed, are deeply suspicious of questions, but they cannot resist a silence. Mrs. Whitcomb provided, "Mr. Daniel was not expected." "No?" "He wrote to Sir Malcolm 3 weeks ago to say he was coming back. Sir Malcolm did not mention it to the others until the week before he arrived." She resumed her polishing. "There was a good deal of rearranging to be done." "Of rooms?" Another pause. "Of other things?" Poirot studied the side table with its arrangement of photographs. He counted them. 6 frames, all standing. And there, at the back, the space where the 7th frame had stood, the ghost of it visible in the slightly less faded rectangle of polished wood beneath. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said pleasantly, "I noticed that one of the photographs appears to have been recently removed. I wonder if you could tell me—" "I couldn't say anything about that," said Mrs. Whitcomb, with a firmness that told him she could say a great deal. He thanked her and left her to her polishing. He found Laura Hargreaves in the morning room at 11 o'clock, ostensibly writing letters. The fire was unlit. The fireplace, he noted, that the family claimed never drew properly. And she wore a cardigan against the chill with the air of someone who has long since stopped expecting the room to be otherwise. She put down her pen when he entered, and he understood from the promptness of the gesture that she had been waiting for him. "You have been moving through the house," she said. "I have been enjoying its many points of interest." He settled into the chair opposite her and regarded her with the mild, approachable expression he had cultivated over many decades precisely because it encouraged candour. "You wrote to me, madame, that something felt wrong. Now that I am here, I wonder if you might be more specific." Laura was quiet for a moment. She was not, he thought, a woman who spoke carelessly. "It is Daniel's return," she said at last, "not Daniel himself. I have nothing against Daniel. But something about his coming back has shifted things. Malcolm is different since the letter arrived. Eleanor is different, even Adrian, though he would never admit it." "Different in what manner?" "Watchful." She considered the word and appeared to find it adequate. "As though they are all waiting for something to be said and dreading it equally." "And you have no knowledge of what that something might be?" "I have suspicions." She met his eyes steadily. "When Daniel left 20 years ago, it was not a simple departure. There was an accusation. Money, I believe. Malcolm accused him of something. I was not yet in the family then, and no one has ever spoken of it directly. But it is there. You can feel it in every room." "Like the cold in this fireplace," Poirot murmured. Something shifted in Laura's expression. Surprise, and then a kind of relief. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." He left her to her letters and stood for a moment in the hall, considering. Through the window beside the front door, he could see Daniel in the garden, moving along the gravel path with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the ground before him. And above Poirot, in the domestic silence of the house, the staircase rose in its broad, carpeted sweep. The brass rods catching the thin autumn light, each one in its place, each one gleaming with Eleanor's diligent attention. Each one, Poirot noted, precisely as it should be. For now. He stood quite still for a moment, in the manner of a man in whom a thought has just arrived without yet declaring its full meaning. Then he straightened the angle of the barometer on the wall by a precise 3 degrees and went to find his hat. There was, he decided, considerable virtue in a walk before luncheon, and Daniel Hargreaves had been in that garden for a very long time. Chapter 3. The Crack in the Foundation. The garden at Greythorne was not a place designed for pleasure. It was a place designed for maintenance. The beds were clipped and ordered, the paths raked to a smoothness that suggested purpose rather than invitation. Even the copper beech tree under which Daniel stood had been pruned into a shape that was less natural than supervised, as though the garden, like the house it served, had been taught over decades to contain itself. Poirot descended the stone steps from the terrace and walked towards him, at a pace that was leisurely without being casual. Daniel heard him coming. He did not turn immediately, which told Poirot something. A man who turns at once is startled or nervous or eager. Man who waits to turn has decided, in those few seconds, how he wishes to be seen. Monsieur Poirot. Daniel's expression was composed but watchful, the expression of a man who had learned, perhaps in harder places than Surrey, to betray nothing until he understood the terrain. Taking the air. "I find that the mind benefits from a change of scene," Poirot said pleasantly, coming to stand beside him. "You yourself appear to be a man who thinks well outdoors." I find it easier to think where no one can hear me. Daniel paused. That was not an especially subtle remark on my part. On the contrary, subtlety is overrated. I have found the direct observation, properly delivered, saves a great deal of time. Poirot regarded the rear facade of the house with his head slightly tilted. From here it presented 3 rows of windows, many of them dark. You have been away a long time, Monsieur Hargreaves. 22 years. And yet you returned. Poirot allowed the observation to settle before continuing. Most men who have been away 22 years have strong reasons for staying away. It follows that the reasons for returning must be stronger still. Daniel was quiet. He took a cigarette from his coat pocket and lit it with the practiced motion of a man who smokes not out of pleasure, but out of necessity. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke disperse in the cool air. "My father is ill," he said at last. "His heart. The doctor visits weekly now. I'm told things are stable. But stable with a man of 72 is another word for temporary. You wished to see him before—" "I wished," Daniel said, with a precision that suggested the word had been selected carefully, "to settle something, before it became impossible to settle." He looked at Poirot then directly. "You are here because Laura wrote to you. She will not have told you that, but it is the only explanation. She has a habit of solving problems by finding the correct person and pointing them at the problem. It is one of her better qualities. She wrote that she felt something was wrong in the house. Something has been wrong in this house for 25 years. He drew on his cigarette. Whether it is any of your business or mine at this point is another question. What occurred 25 years ago? Poirot asked, with the tone of a man posing a question whose answer he does not yet know, which was true, and whose answer he intended to obtain, which was equally true. Daniel looked at him steadily. You would do better to ask Eleanor that. He dropped the cigarette and ground it into the gravel with his heel, and walked back toward the house with the particular gait of a man who has said more than he intended, and is not yet sure whether he regrets it. Poirot remained where he stood, regarding the extinguished cigarette. Then he looked up at the house, counting windows, until he found the one from which a pale face was watching him. Clara. She withdrew the moment their eyes met, and the curtains stilled. He returned inside for luncheon and found the meal already in progress, the family arranged around the table with the slight awkwardness of people who have been talking about something and have recently stopped. Dr. Philip Cartwright had joined them, a trim man of 55 with the careful cheerfulness of a physician who has spent many years delivering news of varying description and has settled on professional warmth as the most humane approach. "The famous Monsieur Poirot," Cartwright said, rising and extending a hand. "I had hoped we might meet. I've read of several of your cases. The business in the Orient? Remarkable." "You are too kind, mon ami." Poirot took his seat. "You visit the family regularly, I understand?" "Weekly, yes. Sir Malcolm's condition requires monitoring. Nothing dramatic, provided he rests adequately and avoids excitement." The doctor's glance moved, briefly and involuntarily, toward Daniel, before correcting itself. "He is a man who has always been difficult to persuade toward restraint." Sir Malcolm, at the head of the table, appeared entirely untroubled by this characterization. "Cartwright worries excessively," he said. "It is what I pay him for." The luncheon was cold meat and pickles, served with the slightly reduced ceremony that midday meals commanded in houses of this kind. Poirot ate sparingly and listened with great attention to a conversation that appeared on its surface to be entirely unremarkable. Adrian spoke about the East Wing renovation, dryly, practically, in the language of a man trying to contain a large subject within small words. The roof was compromised. 2 of the upstairs rooms were unusable. The cost, he implied without stating, was considerable. Sir Malcolm listened without expression. Then he said, "We will manage it as we have always managed things. Eleanor will see to the arrangements." Eleanor, who was passing the bread, did not look up. Of course. Poirot watched her hands. They were steady, entirely, completely steady. And it was this, oddly, that gave him pause. For in his experience, the hands of a person who feels nothing are still, but the hands of a person controlling a great deal are still in quite a different way. After luncheon, the family dispersed. Cartwright stayed for coffee and drew Poirot into conversation in the sitting room with the air of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity. "You are not here merely as a guest," the doctor said without preamble once they were alone. "I am exactly what I appear to be," said Poirot mildly. "A retired detective enjoying the hospitality of an English country house. At my age, one seeks only comfort and tranquillity." Cartwright looked at him with the scepticism this remark deserved. "Laura is worried. I know her well enough to recognize it. And Daniel's return—" He stopped, set down his coffee cup with great deliberateness. "I want to be plain with you, Monsieur Poirot. There are old difficulties in this family, old wounds. If they are opened again, Sir Malcolm's health could suffer considerably. I would not wish—" He paused. "I am asking you, in whatever you are doing here, to bear that in mind." "You are fond of the family," Poirot observed. "I have known them for 15 years. Yes, I am fond of them." He said it simply, without embarrassment. Poirot thanked him for the coffee and for his candour, and saw him to his car. That evening, before dinner, he stood once more in the hall. The light was failing outside, and the interior of the house had settled into the amber dimness of late afternoon. He stood before the side table and looked at the face-down photograph, and then, with a perfectly natural movement, as though merely straightening what had fallen, he turned it over. It was a picture of a young woman holding an infant. The woman was Eleanor, 30 years younger, her expression unguarded in a way her face no longer was, soft and luminous and entirely without armour. The infant was perhaps 3 months old. On the back of the frame, in a hand he did not recognise, someone had written a single word: Thomas. Poirot set the photograph down exactly as he had found it, face down, and went upstairs to dress for dinner. He moved more slowly than usual on the staircase. His little grey cells were doing something, and he did not wish to interrupt them. Chapter 4. What the House Keeps. Sir Malcolm Hargreaves died at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. He was found at the foot of the main staircase by Mrs. Whitcomb, who had risen to investigate a sound she described later, with the compressed understatement of a woman who has seen considerable service, as a disturbance. He lay on his back at the bottom step, his neck broken, his dressing gown spread about him with an odd formal symmetry, as though he had been arranged rather than fallen. Poirot was the 3rd person on the scene, after Mrs. Whitcomb and Eleanor. He noted this. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the hall in her housecoat, a candle in one hand. The power to the hall lamp had tripped, apparently, holding it at an angle that threw long shadows up the staircase. Her face, in that uncertain light, was without expression. Not the blankness of shock, Poirot thought, but something more difficult to name. The face of a person who has arrived at a destination they have long known was coming. He noted that too. Within 20 minutes, the house had assembled itself around the fact of the death. Adrian appeared in pyjamas and a shooting jacket, his face ashen, repeating the word accident at intervals, with the insistence of a man who needs the word to be true. Laura stood beside him with one hand on his arm, saying very little. Daniel came last, fully dressed, which was itself a piece of information, and stood at the edge of the group with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. It was Clara who wept. She sat on the bottom stair, not the bottom stair, Poirot corrected himself, but 3 steps up beside the newel post, and cried with the uncalculated abandon of someone too young to have learned the art of composing grief for an audience. He found he was grateful for it. In a room full of people managing their expressions, one honest face was worth a great deal. Inspector Graves arrived from the village at 3:30. A solid, deliberate man who moved through the house with the careful courtesy of someone aware he is treading on private grief. He spoke briefly with Poirot in the hall, having been informed of his identity by Adrian, and offered the cautious professional regard that policemen generally extend to Poirot in the early stages of an investigation, before experience teaches them to extend rather more. "The family says it was a fall," Graves said. "The family," Poirot agreed, "says many things." He directed the inspector's attention to the 3rd step from the bottom, where the brass stair rod sat slightly askew in its bracket, and to the carpet runner above it, which had loosened from its mooring and now presented a shallow but entirely reliable hazard to a descending foot. Graves crouched and examined it with a torch. Then he examined it again. "It's been unscrewed," he said. He looked up at Poirot. "Deliberately." "That is my own conclusion, yes." "You examined this before." "I examine staircases as a matter of professional habit," Poirot said. "The runner was secure yesterday evening. I observed it when I retired. I am precise about such things." He paused. "It is a habit which has, on more than one occasion, proved useful." Graves stood. He looked at the staircase and then at the closed doors along the hall, and then at Poirot, with the expression of a man revising his morning considerably. The household was asked, with the careful phrasing of authority trying not to alarm, to remain in the house until further notice. Nobody argued. This was, in Poirot's experience, itself suggestive. Innocent people argue. People with things to conceal tend toward a cooperative silence, as though compliance is a form of camouflage. He spent the hours before breakfast in his room, not sleeping. He sat in the armchair by the window with his feet precisely together and his hands folded in his lap, and he thought about staircases. A staircase is, in one sense, a simple object. It connects 2 levels. It has treads and risers, and, in a house of this period and quality, a carpet runner fixed at intervals by brass rods. The rod that had been loosened was the 3rd from the bottom. The point at which a descending foot, having gathered a little confidence, would be most fully committed to the step, and least positioned to recover from a slip. Whoever had loosened it knew 2 things. They knew the staircase with the intimacy of daily use, which pointed to the household, and they knew Sir Malcolm's manner of descending it, slowly, favouring his left leg, placing his right foot first on each tread. The rod had been loosened on the right side of the runner. The first thing was true of everyone in the house. The second thing was true of fewer people. At breakfast, A diminished, subdued affair, the table set from habit in the absence of any instruction to the contrary, Poirot observed the family with the particular quality of attention he reserved for the aftermath of violent events, when people are tired and frightened and have not yet reconstructed their usual management of themselves. Adrian ate nothing and drank 3 cups of tea. Daniel ate with steady concentration, which could indicate callousness or simply the discipline of a man who has learned not to let circumstances interfere with physical necessity. Laura watched Daniel watching his plate and said nothing. Eleanor poured. She moved between the sideboard and the table with her customary efficiency, replenishing and offering and attending, and it was only when she sat that Poirot noticed the small detail he had been waiting for. She had watered the plants in the hall. He had passed them on his way to breakfast. The soil in the blue ceramic pot beside the console table was dark and damp, and the small brass watering can that lived on the bottom shelf of the hall cupboard was not in its place. Eleanor always watered her plants in the morning. She had done so this morning in the hours after her father's death, before the household had assembled, before the inspector had arrived, with the composure of a woman performing a task that needed performing. It was, on its face, a trivial thing. Grief takes strange forms. He did not mistake it for that. He was thinking of what Daniel had said in the garden. Ask Eleanor, and of what Laura had said in the morning room. 25 years. And of the photograph of a young woman with an infant named Thomas. After breakfast, he walked to the foot of the staircase and stood for a moment looking up. The carpet runner had been replaced and the rod resecured by one of the inspector's men as a matter of practicality. The staircase looked entirely as it always had, broad and solid and permanent, the wood gleaming, the brass bright. Beneath it, the narrow door was shut. The coffin cupboard. He had heard Clara use the name, murmured to her mother on the first evening when she thought no one was listening. She had not explained it, and Laura had not asked, which suggested it was a piece of household vocabulary, so old its origins had been forgotten. Poirot crouched, with some effort and the private acknowledgement that his knees were not what they had been, and examined the door. The lock was old. The keyhole was clear of dust on the inside, as though it had been looked through recently, but the exterior plate was tarnished with years of disuse. He straightened and turned to find Mrs. Whitcomb standing at the end of the hall, watching him with the stillness of a woman who has been standing there for some time. "The cupboard," Poirot said conversationally. "It has been locked for many years, I think." "Since 1931, Mrs. Whitcomb said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and the door at the end of the hall swung shut behind her, and Poirot was alone in the silence of the house with the locked door, and the date that had been given to him as deliberately as a key placed in an open hand. 1931, 25 years ago. He looked at the door for a long time. Then he went to find Eleanor Hargreaves. Chapter 5. What the Walls Have Heard. He found her in the kitchen garden. It was not where he had expected to find her. He had looked first in the morning room, then the sitting room, then the small study off the hall that Eleanor used for the household accounts. Each room had been empty but bore the trace of her recent presence. A pen left uncapped, a chair not fully pushed in, a window latch turned back to admit the autumn air. She had moved through the house that morning in the hours after her father's death, and had apparently found no room in it adequate to contain her. The kitchen garden was walled, entered through a wooden door in the south side of the house. Poirot opened it and stepped onto the brick path between the vegetable beds to find Eleanor kneeling beside a row of late cabbages with a small hand fork, loosening the soil around the roots with the unhurried concentration of a woman doing the thing her hands know best. She did not pretend to be surprised. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said without looking up. Poirot settled himself on the low stone bench that ran along the south wall. The morning was cool and bright, and the wall behind him held the warmth of what sun there was. He did not speak immediately. He had found over many years that in certain conversations the most important thing was to allow the other person to determine the pace. Eleanor set down the fork. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with an expression that he could only describe in the private vocabulary of his observations as a face from which the performance has been removed. "You wish to know about Thomas," she said. "I wish to know whatever you are willing to tell me," Poirot replied. "I do not compel, mademoiselle. I only listen." She pulled off her gardening gloves and held them in her lap. "He was my son," she said. "He was born in the spring of 1930. He died the following year in October." A pause. "He was 14 months old." "The staircase," Poirot said quietly. "Yes." She looked at the far wall of the kitchen garden where the espaliered pear tree spread its skeletal arms against the stone. He had learned to walk. They do at that age. They are so proud of it, so determined. He had pulled himself up by the newel post and taken 3 or 4 steps, and then he... She stopped. "It was an accident. I was in the kitchen. I heard it." "You were alone in the house?" "My father was in London. Adrian was away at school. It was a Tuesday." She said this last detail with the particularity of someone for whom that Tuesday has remained entirely vivid for 25 years. "Mrs. Whitcomb was with me. She carried him to the sofa." The kitchen garden was very quiet. Somewhere above the wall, a wood pigeon called and was answered. "And the cupboard beneath the staircase," Poirot said. "It was sealed afterward." "My father sealed it. He had Thomas's things put inside, the small things, his shoes, a toy rabbit he was particularly attached to." Her voice was level, in the manner of a person describing something they have described many times in private to themselves, so that the words no longer break. "He said it was kinder not to have them about. I was not consulted on the matter. You disagreed." "I disagreed with a great many things that were done in the weeks after Thomas died. I was not in a condition to say so at the time, and by the time I was, the arrangements had hardened into fact." She looked at him then, directly. "That is how things worked in this house, Monsieur Poirot. Decisions were made. You were informed of them afterward, if at all." "Thomas's father," Poirot said, he was not my husband. He was a young man I had known for 2 years. My father did not approve of him. When I told my father I was expecting a child, there was a conversation of the kind that leaves very little room for further discussion." She smoothed the gloves in her lap with great precision. The young man was spoken to. He went away. I remained. "And Daniel?" Poirot asked. "Where was Daniel in all of this?" Something changed in Eleanor's face at the name. Not softening, precisely, but a slight release of the tension that held it together. Daniel was here. He was the only one who... He was 26. He sat with me in those weeks. He did not say very much. He was not, even then, a great talker. But he was there. And yet, the following year, he left. The year after that. She picked up the fork again, turned it in her hands without using it. My father accused him of taking money from the firm. £50. There had been a discrepancy in the accounts. She paused. The money had not been taken by Daniel. I knew it at the time. I said so. My father did not believe me or chose not to. She set the fork down again. Daniel went to Australia. He never wrote to my father. He wrote to me once from Melbourne. He said he hoped I was well. That was all. Poirot was quiet for a moment, assembling what he had been given. The pieces did not yet make a complete picture, but their edges were becoming clearer. You kept his exercise book, he said, in the morning room, behind the Surrey churches. For the first time, something crossed Eleanor's face that was not quite grief and not quite warmth, but occupied the narrow territory between them. You are thorough, Monsieur Poirot. I try to be. He paused. Mademoiselle Hargreaves, when your father announced at dinner that you would be needed to manage the East Wing renovation, that more would be required of you, what did you feel? The question sat between them in the cool air. Eleanor looked at the cabbages. I felt, she said carefully, that I was looking at the next 10 years of my life, and that they were identical to the 10 years before them, and the 10 years before that. And Daniel's return had changed nothing. Daniel's return changed everything and nothing simultaneously, which is worse. She stood, brushing soil from the knees of her skirt with brisk, automatic movements. He came back to settle something, as he said. What he wished to settle was the accusation. He wished our father to acknowledge before he died that it was false, to clear his name. She looked at Poirot with an expression he found difficult to read. My father refused. 2 days before he died, they were in the study together for 40 minutes. I stood in the hall and heard my father's voice. Not the words, only the tone. He was implacable to the last. He would not yield. And afterward? After Daniel came out of the study. He went to the garden. He stayed there until dark. She gathered her gloves and her fork. I brought him his dinner on a tray. He did not ask me to. I simply did it. Poirot rose from the bench. One last question, if you will permit. On the night your father died, did you hear anything? Before Mrs. Whitcomb raised the alarm? Eleanor looked at him steadily. I heard the sound of a door closing quietly. I thought it was the wind. Which door? The door at the top of the staircase landing, the one that leads to the linen cupboard and the old nursery. She held his gaze. There is no wind that opens that door, Monsieur Poirot. It has a very particular latch. She went inside. Poirot remained in the kitchen garden for some time after she had gone, his hands clasped at his back, his face tilted toward the October sky. The wood-pigeon called again from somewhere beyond the wall, and this time there was no answer. He thought about doors that close quietly in the night. He thought about a child's toy rabbit locked in a cupboard for 25 years. And he thought, with the slow and terrible precision that his little grey cells sometimes arrived at, that the answer to what had happened in this house was not a single thing, but a weight, an accumulation of silences and surrenders and closed doors. And that it had been building, with the patience of a house settling into its foundations, for a very long time indeed. Chapter 6. The Loyal and the Lost. The afternoon post arrived at 2:30. Poirot observed this from the sitting-room window, where he had stationed himself with a cup of tea and the appearance of a man doing nothing in particular. The postman's bicycle appeared at the gate, the letters were deposited in the brass box beside the front door, and Mrs. Whitcomb collected them with the same expression she brought to all her tasks. The expression of a person for whom duty has long since ceased to require justification. He was not thinking about the post. He was thinking about Daniel Hargreaves and the study door that had closed 40 minutes on an implacable man, and what a person does with 40 minutes of refusal. He had requested that morning a brief word with Inspector Graves. Graves had obliged him in the dining room, where the family had temporarily ceased to gather for obvious reasons, and had confirmed two things. The medical examiner placed the time of death between 1 and 3 in the morning, and a search of Sir Malcolm's study had produced, in the top drawer of the desk, a will, recently revised, dated 6 weeks prior, which altered the distribution of the estate in ways that Graves had not yet disclosed to the family, but which, from the slight compression of his mouth as he mentioned it, were not without significance. Poirot had thanked him and asked one further question. Had any person in the household a definite alibi for the relevant hours? Graves had looked at him with the expression of a man delivering an answer he finds professionally inconvenient. No, he had said. The family had retired separately. Mrs. Whitcomb had been in her room on the upper floor until the sound that had woken her. No one could speak for anyone else. Which meant, Poirot reflected now, that no one could be eliminated. And that was, in its own way, a form of information. He set down his teacup and went to find Daniel. He located him in the study, the same study where, 2 days before his death, Sir Malcolm had delivered his final refusal. Daniel was sitting in the leather chair behind the desk with a glass of whiskey and an expression of a man conducting an argument with someone who was no longer present to argue back. He looked up when Poirot entered, but made no move to rise. "I expected Graves," he said, "not you. Inspector Graves will come in his own time." Poirot took the chair on the visitor's side of the desk and regarded Daniel with the equanimity of a man who is not troubled by being unwelcome. "I wish to speak with you first." "About what, precisely?" "About the conversation you had with your father 2 days ago, in this room." Daniel turned the glass in his hands. "Eleanor told you." "She told me it occurred. She told me the outcome. She did not tell me what passed between you because she was in the hall and could not hear it. I am asking you." A long pause. Daniel appeared to be weighing something. Not whether to speak, Poirot judged, but how much of the truth was required, and whether partial truth would serve better than the whole of it. He decided, apparently, on the whole. "I came back to make him say it," Daniel said, "that he knew that the money business was a fabrication, or at the very least a mistake he had allowed to stand because it was convenient for him. I wanted him to acknowledge it in front of a witness, in writing if possible, so that it was on record." He looked at the desk surface. He declined. He said the matter had been settled long ago, and he saw no purpose in revisiting it. He said— Daniel stopped, and something moved through his expression that was not grief, but was adjacent to it. He said that what was past, and that a man who cannot accept that wastes his life. He said it with complete serenity, as though he had never wronged anyone. "And you accepted this?" "I didn't accept it. I told him that the past has a way of remaining present whether one accepts it or not. He told me to close the door on my way out." He drank. "So I closed the door on my way out." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "And that evening, after dinner, when the household retired?" "I went to bed. I read until midnight, approximately, and then slept." His eyes met Poirot's without wavering. "I heard nothing until Mrs. Whitcomb raised the alarm. I came downstairs and found what you found." "Fully dressed," Poirot observed. "I sleep badly in this house. I had been lying on the bed rather than in it." His expression was steady, but a muscle in his jaw held a tension that the rest of his face declined to acknowledge. "You are deciding whether to believe me." "I am always deciding whether to believe people," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is the nature of my occupation. Tell me, did you know about Thomas?" The question landed differently than Daniel had expected. His composure shifted, fractionally, in the manner of a man who is prepared for several questions, but not this particular one. "Eleanor's son. Yes, I was here when he was born and when he died." A pause. "I was here for considerably more of it than our father was, in practical terms. And the accusation, the money, it came the following year. 14 months after Thomas died. Yes. You believe it was connected, that your father wished you gone?" Daniel looked at the window. Outside, the copper beech was shedding its leaves in the thin afternoon wind, copper and amber, falling with the slow deliberateness of things that have held on too long. "I have believed many things over 22 years, he said at last. "I have had considerable time to arrange and rearrange them. What I believe now is that my father was a man who found certain kinds of love, the inconvenient kinds, the kinds that complicated his arrangements, easier to remove than to accommodate." He paused. "He removed Thomas's father. He removed me. Eleanor he could not remove, because Eleanor was too useful. So he kept her and used her and called it devotion." Poirot said nothing. He found in this moment that there was nothing useful to say. He left Daniel to his whiskey and the argumentative ghost behind the desk, and made his way back along the hall. As he passed the foot of the staircase, he paused, as he had formed the habit of doing, and looked up its length. The restored runner, the gleaming rods, the landing above in its afternoon shadow. Clara was sitting on the 4th step, her back against the banister, a book open in her lap. She was not reading it. She was watching him. "You sit here often," Poirot said. It was not a question. "I can see both the front hall and the drawing-room door from here," she said. "And people don't look up. They think staircases are for moving, not for sitting." "You are a girl of considerable intelligence," Poirot said. Clara appeared neither flattered nor surprised by this assessment. "I saw Aunt Eleanor on the landing," she said. "The night grandfather died. I couldn't sleep and I came out to get a glass of water. She was standing at the top of the stairs in her dressing gown." She looked at him with her steady, grave regard. She wasn't going up. She was just standing there, looking down. What time was this? The clock in my room said 2:10. I remember because I looked at it when I got back into bed. "Did she see you?" "No, I stayed in the doorway." Clara closed her book carefully. "I didn't say anything to Inspector Graves. I didn't know if I should." A pause. "I'm telling you instead." Poirot regarded her for a long moment. She bore his attention without discomfort, which confirmed what he had suspected from the first evening. That this quiet, watchful girl was perhaps the clearest-eyed person in the house, precisely because she had never been granted the privilege of being important enough to deceive. "You did right to tell me," he said. "And you were right not to tell Inspector Graves. Not yet." She nodded once as though they had reached an agreement of reasonable parties, and returned her eyes to her book. Poirot walked to the window at the end of the hall. The light was going out of the afternoon sky in long, horizontal bands of grey and amber. He thought about Eleanor standing at the top of the staircase at 2:10, 4 or 5 minutes by his calculation, after her father had gone down it for the last time. Not descending, not alarmed, simply standing and looking down, in the manner of a person confirming something. His little grey cells were no longer assembling the picture. The picture, he understood now, was almost complete. What remained was the question he always arrived at last. Not who and not how, but whether he understood, fully in all its human weight. Why? He thought he was beginning to. Chapter 7. The Hand That Feeds. The revised will was read on Friday morning. Inspector Graves had arranged it with the family solicitor, a Mr. Pemberton, who drove down from London in a black Humber and arrived at Greythorne at 10 o'clock, with the careful neutrality of a man who has delivered unwelcome news before and has made his professional peace with it. The family assembled in the sitting-room, all except Mrs. Whitcomb, who waited in the kitchen with the particular stillness of a person who already knows what is in the document and is waiting only for others to learn it. Poirot sat slightly apart in the chair nearest the door, as though he had wandered in by accident and might at any moment wander out again. No one asked him to leave. Mr. Pemberton read in the measured tones of a man for whom language is instrument rather than ornament. The estate was substantial, the house, investments, and the residue of the construction firm's assets, and had been divided in the previous will between Adrian and Eleanor in equal shares, with a smaller provision for Laura and a trust established for Clara. The revised will differed in one significant particular. Daniel had been included. Not equally, Adrian retained the larger share, but materially and in terms that the document described as recognition of a long-standing injustice, a phrase that landed in the sitting-room with the weight of an object dropped from a considerable height. Adrian went very still. Daniel, to his credit, appeared more discomfited than gratified. The expression of a man who has wanted a thing for 20 years and finds, upon receiving a version of it, that it is not precisely the thing he wanted. Eleanor poured the tea. She had brought in the tray before Mr. Pemberton began, and now she moved between the chairs with her usual quiet efficiency, offering cups, ensuring no one was overlooked. Poirot watched her hands, steady as they always were. The teapot did not tremble, the cups did not rattle. She had the composure of a woman in whom steadiness has become so thoroughly habitual that it persists, even in the moments when most people would permit themselves to break. It was only when she sat and the room absorbed itself in the aftermath of the solicitor's departure that Poirot noticed the single departure from her composure. She had poured herself no tea. She sat with her hands in her lap and an empty cup before her, and she looked at the window. He excused himself shortly afterward and went upstairs. He had a particular destination in mind, the door on the landing that Eleanor had identified as having a very particular latch, the door to the old nursery corridor. He had not yet examined it. He had been, in a deliberate and methodical way, leaving certain things until his understanding of the surrounding territory was sufficient to make the examination useful. He believed that moment had arrived. The landing was empty, and the house, in the aftermath of the will reading, had settled into the kind of charged quiet that follows a detonation. When the noise has stopped, but the air has not yet decided what to do with itself. He climbed the second flight of stairs and turned left along the upper passage. The nursery, Doctor was the last on the right. The latch was indeed particular. A heavy iron mechanism of an older design, the sort that required a definite and deliberate lift to open, and would not move with less than full intention. It could not be nudged. It could not be caught by a draught. If it had opened in the night, a hand had opened it. He stood for a moment in the nursery doorway. The room had not been used as a nursery for many years. It held a spare bed, 2 trunks, and the indeterminate accumulation of a household's surplus objects. A broken clock, a rolled carpet, 3 chairs stacked upon one another. The window looked out directly over the landing and the head of the main staircase, which was below and to the right. From this window, on a night when the landing light was out, which it would have been at 2 in the morning, a person could see the top of the staircase quite clearly by the light from the hall below. Not well, but adequately. Adequately enough to confirm what they had arranged to see. He closed the nursery door with some care and went back down. In the afternoon, he sought out Adrian. He found him in the morning room with a glass of something that was not tea, staring at the cold fireplace with the expression of a man who has been presented with a version of his life that requires considerable revision. He looked up at Poirot with no particular welcome, but no hostility either. Hostility requires energy, and Adrian Hargreaves appeared to have very little remaining. "The will," Poirot said, taking the chair opposite without being invited. "It surprises you." "It surprises everyone." Adrian turned the glass in his hands. Though perhaps it should not. Father was not a sentimental man, but he was a man who kept accounts. He liked things to balance. If there was an injustice on the ledger, he would eventually... He stopped. "I do not know when he changed it. Pemberton says 6 weeks ago, which means he changed it after Daniel wrote, to say he was coming back, but before Daniel arrived." He frowned at the glass. "He never mentioned it." "No," Poirot agreed. "He would not have. It was a private reckoning." A pause. "Tell me, Monsieur Hargreaves, the debts your father settled, the business losses over the years." Adrian's expression shifted into something carefully guarded. "Who told you about that?" "A house of this kind, with a family of this duration, accumulates a history." I listened carefully. Poirot folded his hands. The amounts were significant? They were. The word was compressed and did not invite further compression. Father never spoke of it directly. He simply arranged things. Payments appeared. Difficulties resolved themselves. He paused. I was grateful. I was also, I recognize, entirely dependent upon his continuing to be alive and solvent, which is not a comfortable position for a man of 53. "And Eleanor," Poirot said. "Was she aware of these arrangements?" Adrian looked at him with the expression of a man arriving, in this moment, at a realization he should perhaps have reached some time ago. "Eleanor kept the accounts," he said slowly. "She has always kept the accounts." "Oui," said Poirot, and nothing more. He left Adrian to his cold fireplace and walked the length of the hall to the kitchen. Mrs. Whitcomb was preparing the evening meal with the steadfast purposefulness of a woman for whom the routines of domestic life are the only reliable architecture in a shifting world. She looked up at him with the expression she had worn since his arrival. Watchful, measuring, neither friendly nor unfriendly. "The plants in the hall," Poirot said without preamble. "Miss Hargreaves waters them each morning at approximately 8 o'clock. You have observed this for 35 years. "I have," Mrs. Whitcomb agreed. "On the morning after Sir Malcolm died, she had watered them before 7, before the household was awake." He looked at her steadily. did you notice this? A pause of the kind that contains, within it, an entire internal argument conducted and concluded. "I noticed," she said, "and you said nothing." Mrs. Whitcomb set down her wooden spoon. She looked at Poirot with an expression that he recognized, an expression he had seen before in other kitchens, on the faces of other loyal and long-serving women who have spent a lifetime absorbing the costs of other people's arrangements and have their own, very precise understanding of what justice requires. "Miss Eleanor," she said, "has given 50 years to this family. She has given them her youth, her son, She has given everything she had." Her voice was entirely level. Sir Malcolm gave her more work and called it her duty. He sealed her child's things in a cupboard and told her it was kinder. She picked up the spoon again. "I noticed the plants, Monsieur Poirot. I noticed a great many things. I made a decision about what I would say and what I would not say. I have made such decisions before in this house, and I expect I shall make them again." Poirot was quiet for a long moment. "You are telling me," he said at last, "that you are not surprised." "I am telling you," Mrs. Whitcomb said, returning her attention to the stove, "that some things, when they finally happen, feel less like murder and more like the end of a very long sentence." She did not look at him again. Poirot walked back to the hall and stood at the foot of the staircase in the dimming afternoon light, and he thought about sentences, the kind that are imposed and the kind that are served, and the considerable difficulty of distinguishing between them. Above him, the house was silent. Below the stairs, the locked cupboard held its long vigil in the dark. Chapter 8. The Quiet Ones. Saturday arrived with rain. It came in from the west in long grey sheets, obliterating the garden and reducing the copper beech to a dark smudge beyond the sitting-room window. Greythorne turned inward upon itself, as old houses do in wet weather, the rooms growing smaller and the silences thicker, until the whole structure seemed less like a building and more like a held breath. Poirot spent the morning in his room. He was not idle. He sat at the small writing desk with a sheet of paper before him and wrote, in his precise continental hand, a list of facts. Not observations, not impressions, but facts, the kind that could be stated without qualification and would remain standing under the most rigorous examination. He had always found this exercise useful at this particular stage of an inquiry, when the emotional weight of accumulated knowledge threatened to obscure the clean lines of what was actually known. He wrote for 40 minutes. Then he read what he had written. Then he folded the paper, placed it in his breast pocket, and went downstairs. He found the family distributed through the house in the manner of people who are avoiding one, another with great determination, but insufficient space. Adrian was in the study. Laura and Clara were in the sitting-room, Clara reading with genuine attention, Laura with the appearance of it. Daniel was nowhere that Poirot could immediately identify, which was itself a piece of information he filed away. Eleanor was in the dining room, alone, at the head of the table. Not the head where Sir Malcolm had sat. She had taken the chair at the opposite end, the chair that had never, in the history of Poirot's brief residence at Greythorne, been occupied at all. She sat there with a cup of tea and her household account book open before her, entering figures in her small, even hand, and she did not look up when Poirot entered. He sat down. Not at the far end where Sir Malcolm's absence was loudest, but midway along the table, close enough for conversation to be natural. "You are continuing the accounts," he said. "The house does not pause for grief," Eleanor replied without particular inflection. "The butcher's account is overdue. The coal merchant requires a decision about the winter order." She made a final entry and closed the book. Someone must attend to these things. Someone always must. Poirot regarded her with the mild attentiveness he had brought to all his observations of her over the past days. An attentiveness that was, he acknowledged to himself, coloured now by something more than professional interest. He had admired Eleanor Hargreaves from the first evening. He admired her still. This, he had found across a long career, was not incompatible with what he was now required to do. "Tell me," he said, "what you know about Daniel's accusation. The money. You told me your father was wrong, that it was not Daniel who took it." Eleanor raised her eyes from the closed account book. "I told you I said so at the time. That is not quite the same thing." "No," Poirot agreed. "It is not." A pause. "The money was taken, however. £50 vanished from the firm's accounts in 1932. That much was established." "The accounts showed a discrepancy," Eleanor said carefully. "And you kept the household accounts. You were, I think, also assisting your father with correspondence at that time. He had no private secretary in the early years of the firm." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Not guilt, he thought, but the particular stillness of a person watching a door open that they had long known existed. "I managed his correspondence, yes, until he engaged Miss Fellows in 1935. "So you had access to the firm's account books in 1932. The rain moved against the dining room windows in long, articulate pulses. Eleanor sat very straight in the chair at the foot of the table, the chair no one had ever sat in, and looked at Poirot with an expression he could not immediately classify. "Are you asking me," she said at last, "whether I took the money?" "I am asking you," Poirot replied, "to tell me what you know." A long silence. Not the silence of a person constructing a lie, he judged, but the silence of a person deciding whether the truth has finally found its moment. "I took it," Eleanor said. "Not for myself. Thomas's father had written to me, once privately, 6 months after he had been sent away. He was in difficulty. He needed money to leave the country, to make a start somewhere else, because my father had made certain that no position in England would be open to him." She looked at her hands on the closed account book. He had never asked for anything. He did not ask for it as a right. He simply said he was in difficulty, and I had a child who had been his, and I could not— She stopped. "I took £50 from the firm's account and I sent it to him. I entered it against a supplies invoice that I wrote myself." Poirot was very still. "And when the discrepancy was found," he said, "my father discovered it. He came to me directly. He knew the handwriting on the invoice was mine." She met his eyes. "He did not expose me. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said that the matter would be handled. A week later, he told the family that Daniel had been responsible. Daniel, who had been the one person in the house who had consistently defied him, who was inconvenient in ways I was not." Her voice remained level throughout, which cost her, Poirot suspected, rather more than she permitted to show. "I said it was not Daniel. My father said I was confused by grief and that the matter was settled. Daniel left before I could speak to him alone. You wrote to him, in Melbourne. I wrote 3 times. Only the last letter reached him, I think, the one he acknowledged. I could not explain it properly in a letter. I could not write what I had done in a document that might be read by anyone." She paused. and by then a year had passed. Daniel had built a life. I told myself the letter of acknowledgement was enough. I told myself many things over many years, Monsieur Poirot. I became, in time, quite skilled at it. Outside, the rain intensified briefly and then eased. A coal shifted in the fireplace with a soft collapse. When Daniel returned, Poirot said, and your father refused to clear his name, did Daniel know by then what had actually occurred? He suspected. He said as much, obliquely, on the second evening. He said he had never believed himself capable of what he was accused of, and that he had eventually concluded someone else had been protected at his expense. She was quiet for a moment. He did not ask me directly. He would not do that. Because he knew you had been protecting someone. Because he is Daniel, she said simply. Poirot rose from his chair and walked to the window. The garden was invisible behind the rain. Somewhere in the upper floors of the house a door closed. Not the nursery latch, but something lighter, a bedroom door, the ordinary percussion of a household continuing. He thought about the architecture of this particular crime. Not merely its mechanism, the loosened stair rod, the chosen hour, but its deeper structure. The way it had been built, brick by brick, across 25 years of compounding sacrifice and unacknowledged cost. He had investigated murders committed from greed, from passion, from fear, from the sudden catastrophic failure of self-command. He had investigated very few committed from exhaustion. It was, he reflected, the most difficult kind to hold in the mind cleanly, because exhaustion of the kind Laura Hargreaves had carried was not a simple thing. It was a weight added to incrementally, invisibly, until the person beneath it had long ceased to be visible even to themselves. He turned from the window. I must ask you one final question, he said, and I ask it not as an accusation, but because I must understand precisely what occurred. On the night your father died, the loosened rod, you knew which step. Eleanor looked at him across the length of the table at which she had served 10,000 meals, at which she had poured and passed and anticipated and smoothed. And she said with a quietness that was the most terrible thing he had heard in this house, I have walked that staircase every day of my life. Poirot returned to his chair. He sat for a moment without speaking. Then, because it needed to be said, and because he was not a man who avoided the things that needed to be said, he told her that he would be speaking to Inspector Graves that afternoon. He told her what he intended to say, and what he would ask Graves to consider in his report. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she nodded once, with the composure of a woman who has been expecting a thing for some time and finds, upon its arrival, that she is equal to it. I wondered, she said, when someone would see. She rose, straightened the account book with a precise 2-fingered adjustment, and went to see about luncheon. Poirot remained at the table for some time after she had gone, in the quiet of the rain and the empty chairs, and he thought about justice, what it required and what it cost, and the considerable distance between the two. Chapter 9. The Table Where It Happened. The rain had stopped by Sunday morning. It left behind it a washed stillness, the kind that settles over a Surrey landscape in late October, as though the weather itself has concluded something. The garden emerged from the grey in its autumn colours. The copper beach darkened and dripping, the gravel paths running with thin channels of water, the flower beds pressed flat and glistening. Poirot observed it from the dining room window for a moment before turning to address the table. He had asked them all to come. He had done so through Eleanor, which was the natural mechanism of any request in this household, and she had conveyed it without comment, and they had come without arguing. This, too, he noted, was its own form of information. A family that has been waiting for something to be named will not resist the naming when the moment finally arrives. They were arranged as they had always arranged themselves. Adrian at the near end, Laura beside him. Daniel across the table with the quality of careful containment that had characterized him throughout. Clara at the corner, her hands folded, watching. Mrs. Whitcomb stood at the sideboard. He had asked her to remain, and she had accepted this without question, which told him she understood precisely why. Eleanor sat at the foot of the table, not Sir Malcolm's chair, her own chosen place, the one she had occupied on the previous morning when Poirot had found her with the account book. She had, he thought, made a decision about that chair. Poirot remained standing at the centre of the table's length, with his back to the window. He did not pace. He did not perform. He had, over many years, developed a profound distaste for the theatrical variety of revelation. The pointing finger, the sudden accusation designed to produce maximum sensation. What he sought instead was something closer to comprehension. He wanted this family to understand what had happened to them, not merely to learn who had done it. He began, as he always began, with the house. Greythorne, he said, is a house that was built for one purpose and has served, for nearly a century, an entirely different one. It was built as a home. It became, over the decades, a machine. A machine for the production of order, comfort, and the appearance of domestic harmony. And like all machines, it required a source of power. He looked at Eleanor as he said this. She held his gaze without expression. The power of this machine was provided, without interruption and without acknowledgement, by one person. Miss Laura Hargreaves. She managed the household accounts. She supervised the staff. She smoothed the arguments and paid the social debts and kept the schedules upon which this family's entire daily existence depended. He paused. She did this not because she lacked other options. She did it because options in this house were not a thing she was permitted to have. Adrian made a small movement, as though to speak. He did not speak. Her son died on this staircase 25 years ago, Poirot continued. His belongings were sealed in the cupboard beneath it, by a man who told her this was kinder. Her own judgment on the matter was not consulted. The young man she had loved was removed from his position in English life, and from her life, by the same man who told her that her emotions were grief confusion, and that the matter was settled. He allowed this to stand for a moment. The following year, her brother was falsely accused and driven from the house. Miss Eleanor had, in fact, been the source of the account discrepancy. She had taken the money to assist Thomas's father, who had been deliberately ruined. She told her father so. He used the knowledge not to clear Daniel's name, but to secure his own position. He had, from that point forward, a lever, a permanent lever, which he never needed to apply directly because its existence was sufficient. Daniel had gone very still. He was looking at Eleanor across the table with an expression that Poirot found, in this moment, almost unbearable to observe. The expression of a man revising 22 years in the space of 30 seconds. Eleanor did not look at him. She looked at the table. The lever was never spoken of, Poirot said. It did not need to be. Miss Hargreaves remained. She paid Adrian's debts from the household accounts, which she managed, and which she could make to balance in ways that did not require her father's direct involvement. She shielded Laura from Malcolm's less generous impulses. She continued, in short, to give the family everything she had, because to do otherwise would have required her to expose what she had done for Thomas's father, and she would not do that. She had already paid one man's price for that decision. She would not see Daniel pay another. Laura had her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were very bright. 6 weeks before he died, Poirot continued, Sir Malcolm revised his will. He included Daniel, belatedly, privately, in the silent accounting of a man who keeps ledgers of all kinds. He did not tell Daniel he had done this. He refused when Daniel came to him in this house to say the words aloud. He would balance the ledger by his own method and in his own time, but he would not yield the point. He had never yielded a point in his life, and he was not prepared to begin at 72. He paused. The room was entirely silent save for the faint settling of the house around them. When Sir Malcolm informed Miss Hargreaves that Daniel's return meant additional responsibilities, more years of service, more sacrifice, she reached a conclusion she had been, I believe, approaching for some considerable time. Not in rage, not in the heat of a single moment. She reached it with the quiet, terrible clarity of a person who has finally understood that the thing they have been waiting for will not arrive by any other means. He looked at the staircase through the dining room doorway, its broad sweep, its gleaming rods, the third from the bottom now restored and unremarkable. She knew the staircase as she knew her own hands. She knew which rod to loosen, and on which side, and she knew that Sir Malcolm, who would never ring his bell for help when his pride allowed him to manage alone, would descend those stairs that night rather than summon Eleanor to bring him his sleeping draught. He turned back to the table. She was at the top when he fell. She did not go down to him. She went to water her plants instead, the plants she has always watered in the morning, watered that day before 7 o'clock, because her hands needed something ordinary to do, and because she has never in her life permitted herself the luxury of doing nothing. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a family hearing itself described accurately for the first time. It was Adrian who spoke first, and what he said was not what Poirot expected. "She paid my debts," he said, very quietly, as though the sentence had arrived from a great distance. "Yes," said Poirot. "I never—" Adrian stopped. He appeared to be experiencing the particular discomfort of a man who has been comfortable for a very long time, and has just now understood what that comfort rested upon. "I never asked her. She simply did it," Laura said beside him. Her voice was careful and controlled, as she simply did everything. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained in its complexity both an apology and a reckoning. We let her, all of us let her. Daniel had said nothing since Poirot began. He said nothing now. He was looking at Eleanor with the steady, grieved attention of a man who has been handed the full account of a debt he did not know existed, and is determining in silence what honour requires of him. Eleanor, for her part, sat at the foot of the table with her hands in her lap, and an expression of the most profound stillness Poirot had encountered in 50 years of examining human faces. It was not relief precisely. It was not resignation. It was the expression, he thought, of a person who has carried a thing alone for so long that the act of setting it down in front of others feels less like loss than like the answer to a question she had nearly stopped believing would be asked. "Eleanor," Daniel said at last. One word, her name. He said it in the tone of a man who has said her name in his private thoughts for 22 years in a foreign country, in a different register entirely from the one the family used. She looked at him then. Poirot did not look away. He had spent a career watching human nature reveal itself in concentrated form, and he had learned that the moments of revelation were not to be avoided. They were to be witnessed. It was, in the end, the only decent thing one could do with them. "I am sorry," Eleanor said. Not to the room, to Daniel. She said it simply, and without ornament, in the manner of a woman who has spent 50 years providing exactly what was needed and has at last identified what this moment requires. Inspector Graves, who had been standing quietly in the doorway throughout, stepped forward. Poirot moved aside to let him pass and looked, for a long moment, at the empty chair at the head of the table. Then he looked at Eleanor, sitting at the foot. He thought, she chose the right end. Chapter 10. The Empty Chair. She put on her own coat. This was the detail that stayed with Poirot afterward, long after the inspector's car had disappeared down the lane and the sound of its engine had been absorbed by the Sunday afternoon stillness. Eleanor had gone to the hall cupboard, the same cupboard from which she had taken the watering can, and removed her grey wool coat from its hook and put it on with the same unhurried precision she brought to all things. She had buttoned it from the bottom. She had smoothed the collar. She had picked up her handbag from the console table and looped it over her arm. She had not packed a bag. There had been no time for that. And in any case, Poirot suspected she would not have done so regardless. Laura Hargreaves was not the kind of woman who made preparation for her own departure. She had spent 50 years making preparation for everyone else's. Inspector Graves had been quietly correct throughout. A word here, a gesture there, the careful professional courtesy of a man who understands that the letter of his duty and the spirit of it do not always occupy the same room simultaneously. He had looked at Poirot once, at the door, and Poirot had given him the slight inclination of the head that passes, between men who understand one another, for a great deal of unspoken communication. Then she was gone. The family remained at the dining table for some time afterward, in the particular suspension of people who have been at the centre of something enormous and have not yet been released from it. Adrian sat with both hands flat on the tablecloth, staring at nothing. Laura had her arm around Clara, who was not crying. She had done her crying in the early days, and had arrived, with the resilience of the young, at something quieter and more considered. Daniel had not moved from his chair. It was Daniel who broke the silence. "She took the money for Robert," he said. Not a question. He was speaking, Poirot understood, to no one in particular, or rather to the room, to the house, to the long accumulation of years that had produced this Sunday afternoon. His name was Robert Fenwick. He went to Canada eventually. I met a man in Melbourne who had known him slightly. Nobody spoke. "She never told me," Daniel continued. 22 years. She carried that. He looked at the table. "I would not have let her carry it." "That," Laura said quietly, "is precisely why she did not tell you." Daniel considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the expression of a man accepting a truth that does not comfort him, but has the considerable virtue of being accurate. Poirot excused himself. He went to the kitchen where Mrs. Whitcomb had returned without ceremony to the preparation of the Sunday luncheon. She was peeling potatoes at the sink, her back to him, in the posture of a woman who has decided that the world will continue to require feeding regardless of what has passed in the dining room, and that this is a sufficient philosophy. On the refrigerator, held by a small magnet in the shape of a blue teapot, was a shopping list in Eleanor's handwriting. Milk, tea, Adrian's, digestive biscuits, string, stamps. Poirot looked at it for a moment. 5 items, an ordinary list for an ordinary week, written by a woman who had not known, when she wrote it, that she would not be the one to fulfill it. Or perhaps she had known. He could not say. "Will you manage?" he asked Mrs. Whitcomb. She set down a potato. "I have managed this house through a great deal, Monsieur Poirot. I shall manage it through this." He believed her entirely. He collected his hat and his coat and his small, immaculate travelling bag, which George had packed with the meticulous care that Poirot's valet brought to all things, and carried them to the hall. He had telephoned for a car from the village. It was due at 3 o'clock. He had 20 minutes. He spent them in the hall. He stood before the side table and looked at the photographs. The 6 that remained standing, and the 7th, which he had replaced face up after his conversation with Eleanor in the kitchen garden. Thomas looked back at him from his mother's arms, round and unaware and entirely new to the world, with the guileless opacity of all infants who have not yet acquired the knowledge of what the world intends for them. Poirot looked at him for a long time. Then he walked to the foot of the staircase. The house was quiet above and below. Through the dining-room doorway he could hear the low murmur of the family's voices. Not words, only the texture of conversation, tentative and searching. The sound of people beginning the long and necessary work of speaking honestly to one another. It was not, he reflected, a sound this house had often produced. He looked at the staircase, the 3rd rod from the bottom gleaming in its bracket, the runner smooth and untroubled, the wood of each tread worn to a particular warmth by decades of the same feet on the same path at the same hours. The staircase on which Thomas had learned to walk and fallen. The staircase on which Sir Malcolm had descended, for the last time, on a night when someone who loved this house and had been consumed by it had finally, irreversibly, decided that enough had been given. He crouched with his familiar difficulty and looked at the narrow door beneath it, the coffin cupboard, sealed in 1931. He straightened and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He stood with his hand on the handle for a moment. Then he opened the door. The interior was very small and very dark and smelled of cedar and old cloth and time. There was a cardboard box on the single shelf. In the box, a pair of small leather shoes, barely worn. A knitted rabbit, grey with age, one ear slightly detached and restitched at some point with thread that did not quite match. A folded blanket, white with a blue border, a child's wooden spoon. Beneath these things, at the bottom of the box, a single photograph. Eleanor and an infant, younger than the one in the hall. Days old, perhaps. Eleanor's face in the photograph was the most unguarded thing he had seen in this house. He closed the box. He closed the door. He did not lock it. The motor car arrived at 3 o'clock precisely, and the driver, a taciturn man from the village who had the good sense to understand that his passenger was not disposed to conversation, collected the travelling bag from the step and placed it in the boot without ceremony. Poirot stood in the doorway of Greythorne for a moment. The family came to see him off, as families do. Some impulse of social form persisting even on days when form seems a poor kind of comfort. Adrian shook his hand with a grip that conveyed something he appeared unable to say aloud. Laura said with quiet directness that she was glad he had come, which Poirot found he was grateful for, even though gladness was not precisely what he himself felt about the week's events. Clara stood at the back. She had her book under her arm. As Poirot passed her, she said, in a low voice that was for him alone, "Will she be all right?" Poirot paused. He regarded her with the full attention she deserved. "She will be looked after," he said. "I have spoken with Inspector Graves at some length. There are circumstances in this case which mitigate considerably. These things are never certain, you understand. But I believe she will be looked after." Clara nodded with the gravity of a person filing information for use later. Daniel was last. He stood at the edge of the group with his hands in his coat pockets. The posture in which Poirot had first observed him, under the copper beech tree, on the afternoon of his arrival. He looked older than he had that afternoon. He also looked, in some way that was difficult to specify, less like a man who is merely inhabiting a space, and more like one who is considering whether to remain in it. He and Poirot did not exchange many words. They were not, either of them, men who used words as other than instruments. "Take care of the house," Poirot said, "and of each other. It is more difficult than people generally suppose." Daniel looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said, "I imagine it is." Poirot descended the front steps and got into the car. He did not look back as the lane received them, and the hedgerows closed behind the car, and Greythorne House receded into the October afternoon. He had found over the years that looking back at houses served no useful purpose. The house would continue in any case, bearing its weight, holding its memories, growing as all old houses do, around whatever was buried in its walls. He looked instead at the road ahead and at his own gloved hands in his lap, and he thought, as he was always driven to think at the conclusion of these affairs, about the curious human capacity for endurance, for carrying things that should not, by any reasonable assessment, be carried, for continuing to provide warmth and order and care in the full knowledge that these things may go unrecognized, unreciprocated, and largely unseen. Laura Hargreaves had done a terrible thing. She had also, for 50 years, done an extraordinary one. Hercule Poirot found, as the car turned onto the main road and the village of Greythorne fell away behind him, that he was entirely unable to hold only one of these truths without the other, and that this, in the end, was perhaps the most honest thing he could say about the case. He settled back against the seat. He tilted his head, and he thought, with the precision and the sorrow and the irreducible clarity of his little grey cells, that justice is a large room with many windows, and the light that enters through each one falls differently upon everything inside.